Hey, welcome to the Breakaway Podcast. We hope you enjoyed the talks and stick around for more at the end.
Well, if you would have asked me when I was 4 years old what was the most valuable thing in my life, I would have shown you this. This is Grover. And Grover was more than just a best friend to me. Grover was a constant companion. You can see it by his strangled neck, because I used to carry him around like this everywhere I went. And he wasn't just a companion, he was a source of security. He went everywhere with me. He was my pillow, which you can tell by the matted fur and kind of drool stains all over him. He was also a source of fun. I used to take Grover and throw him into the fan, and I would pretend he could fly, and I would just see where he landed somewhere in the room, and it was tons of fun for everybody, right? But when I was a little guy, Grover was everything to me, and if you would have tried to step between me and my Grover, well, you would have had every bit of 30 pounds of 3-year-old anger coming right into your world, am I right? Because you don't separate a man from his Grover, okay? Now, I remember one time my aunt came to me and offered to take me to the zoo, which was huge because at that point in my life, most of the animals I had seen were just in books. And so the opportunity to see like a zebra or a monkey or an elephant like in real life was just huge. She was offering me the chance to progress into this entirely new realm of experience heretofore unknown to me. So I said yes, and we went. Grover, me, and Aunt Stacy headed to the zoo. And I remember when we got there, she paid, and we were walking in, and right when we were on our way to the monkey cages, the zookeeper stepped in front of me. And I remember he looked down at me, and he said, "You can't carry that stuffed animal in here, son." And I remember looking at him like, is he being serious? And I looked over at my aunt like, hey, straighten this guy out. Like, talk to this guy. He's out of his mind, right? And I remember looking up at her face, and she looked down at me, and she said, I think you better give it to him. And I remember my first response was something like, ugh. But as I stood there, my little mind contemplated, wait a minute, if I want to progress into this entirely new realm of experience, I got to make a decision here. And I had to look into the face of authority and the face of love. And I had to hand over that which is most precious to me. Question. If I was to ask you today, what is the thing that is most precious to you? I mean, the thing that you would grip onto today, that gives you worth, the thing that defines you, the best thing you have going for you. That thing, what would it be for you? For some of you, it's your relationships. You go, man, I have some great friendships. I got relationships out here that nobody else has got. For some of you, it's your body. You're all cut up. And no matter how bad a day it's been, the mirror will always be a source of encouragement for you, all right? That's the world you live in. For some of you, it's your beauty, all right? That's your key that unlocks every door in this world, all right? For some of you, that's not really it, but your intellect is what's working for you, all right? Maybe the rest of your family didn't go to college, but you're the smart one. You're the one that's going to get a good job. You're the one that's going to drive a nice car, right? Maybe it's your talent. Maybe it's your money. Maybe it's not even something you actually possess now. Maybe it's just a dream you have, or a desire, or a goal, the thing that drives and motivates much of what you do. And for some of you, it's a desire to attain some level financially, or some level in your career, or to attain some role. Some of you just go, I want to be a mom, all right? I want to have a husband and kids, and I want to be soccer mom, right? And you have this thing that you've got a grip on. And if anything even threatened to step between you and it, your first response would be, what is that thing? All right? That you would recoil because it is so connected with you and who you are. Well, keep that thing in the front of your mind. And if you take notes, or even write it down on a piece of paper, because that's where we're going tonight. We're wrapping up tonight this series on Abraham. And Abraham in the Old Testament was given to us as a picture of a man who lived by faith. And faith, this life of faith, is really just a progressive and successive handing over of parts of our lives to God and his lordship, all right? And you see that in your own life. If you are someone who knows God and walks with him, the first thing you hand over to God is your eternal destination. You say, I don't want to go to hell. I do want to go to heaven. Okay, God, I trust you with my eternal state, all right? And that's how most of us begin. But that's not where it ends. As you begin a relationship with God, he begins to move into all the other arenas of your life and say, yeah, I want to be Lord over that too. Yeah, I want my way in this area too. And that's the Christian life. And that's what we've seen in Abraham's life. That's what God's been doing with him from the beginning. God came to him and said, hey, I want you to walk away from the security of your dad's money and you inheriting his job after he dies. Will you trust me? And God says, yeah, okay, I'll trust you. More than money, more than what I thought my future would be. He says, okay, will you let me have your relationships, who you're friends with? Will you let me be Lord of that? Okay, God, you got that. Will you let me rule over your style of relating? See, Abraham had this kind of sly way of sort of telling half-truths to get what he wants. And God says, hey, you walk with me now. I need control of your mouth, and you can't work it that way anymore. And Abraham says, okay. And all through his life, it's God successively moving into Abraham's life and saying, yeah, I got to rule that. Yeah, I got to guide that. Okay, that has to come under my rule. And you see him moving around in his life. And sometimes Abraham is terrible at submitting to the Lord. Sometimes he's fantastic at it. But in this journey of faith, God is constantly pressing on his life, saying, yeah, I want you to give me that too. And as we hit the climax in his life tonight, we're going to get to his most precious thing. And God's going to put his hand on it. And we're going to see how he does. So Genesis 22 opens in verse 1. It says, now it came about after these things that God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham, and he said, here I am. So it says after these things. What are these things? Well, it's been a long life. He's over 100 years old. And it's been a life of disappointments, of wanting a kid and not getting it. It's been a life of hope. God promised him you'll have a kid, but it was 2.5 decades before he got it. It's a life filled of hurts, some broken relationships, some having to pass on some ways to advance socially that he didn't take part in. But it's been a life of blessing. God's taken care of him. It's been a full life. And more immediately, where we intersect with Abraham at this point in his life, he's actually in a really, really good place. Here he's later in life, and God has finally given him the son that he always longed for. He gave him his boy, Isaac, whose name means laughter. And he called him that because he's brought joy into our life, and he's the fulfillment of God's promise. He has his son. And not only does he have the son finally, he's been journeying and sojourning his whole life with no peace. And finally, God's let him settle. You see, in the last chapter, it said he planted a tamarisk tree, which when you start planting trees, that means you're not going anywhere. He's like, this is my tree, this is my house. And he just kind of sat down and he's like, I'm stopping here. And so when we intersect with him in his life, he's on the back end of his life here. And he's got the wife, he's got the kid, he's got the tree. He's living, it says, in the land of the Philistines. That's the Mediterranean. Literally, he is on the Mediterranean coast. He is where cruise ships go today to hang out, okay? So his life's looking good. He's on the beach, in the shade, under the tree, laying out with Sarah next to him, right? Sipping pina coladas. Jimmy Buffett's playing in the background. Child of Promise is playing out in the waves. It's good to be Abraham. And into that moment, after these things, it says, and God comes to test him. Now, why does God do stuff like that? Why is God going to mess with him in this moment? Well, James chapter 1, verse 2 says, consider it pure joy, my brother, when you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith develops perseverance. Perseverance must finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking in anything. And what we see is it's not just God being mean. God says, I want to produce a maturity in you. I want to help you develop as a human being. And so I'm going to put some tests in here to help shape you, to make you mature, not lacking. He told the Israelites, I led you through that great and terrible wilderness to test you so that it may go well with you in the end. So God's doing this because he cares, because he loves Abraham, and he wants it to go well with him. So he's going to move in, and he's going to test him. And it starts out pretty good. God calls him, Abraham. And I love that it's got this exclamation point. God's like, Abraham. And he's like, yes, God. All right. And it starts out okay. Abraham's answer is the perfect answer. He just says, Hineni, here I am. And it's this idea of a responsiveness to God that's immediate. I'm right here, God, all of me. And that's a great, you could do a whole sermon on that. Is that, if we wrote a story of your life, would that be what people would write about you? When God calls, I go, here, I'm right here. There's this instant responsiveness to God. He's starting off good. And yet as he comes to God, God's going to lay out the test for him in verse 2. It says, and he said, take now your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I'll tell you. Now, it's important to notice here, and we've talked about this before, in the Old Testament, there's a real economy of words, all right? All of creation, the creation of every known thing, God describes in one chapter, Genesis 1, right? He's like, there was light, there was dark, and there was water, and I spun it, and there's the earth. Okay, we done? All right, in one chapter, he covers it all. We're going to get one whole chapter talking about this moment, the language is going to slow down and it's deliberate. It's to show you, hey, what I'm doing here with Abraham is as big a deal as you think it is, and you think it should be. And so God comes to him and says, hey, take your son, that's your boy, your only son, the only one you have, the one you love. He's your heartbeat. He's the laughter in your life. Isaac, your laughter. He says, and offer him as an olam. An olam was a sacrifice that you burnt up the whole thing. You didn't save any of it. Some sacrifices, you kept a little piece of this one, you cut it up, and you burned the whole thing as an offering of worship to God. He says, I want it all. So God's testing Abraham. What's the test? Abraham, will you take that thing you prize more than anything, and will you give it to me? Will you give it to me? Will you put it in my hands? Will you value me more than anything else on this earth? And will you trust me even when it looks like I'm destroying everything you hold dear? Will you trust me? That's the test. That's the test. Now, question. Why does God do that? Why do that to him? He's an old man. You finally gave him the kid. Why are you doing this to him? Right? You ever wondered that? Why does God do this kind of stuff to us? Well, the quickest and most succinct answer I could give you is this. I would say, number one, God loves us. We know this. 1 John says God is love. It's an essential quality of God. He's where love comes from. Jeremiah 31 says the Lord appeared saying, I have loved you with an everlasting love. Love is an essential quality of God, and he has been loving from eternity past to eternity present. God is love. That's point one. Point two, in loving us, he wants what's best for us. He wants what's best for us. What's best for us is him. Is him. God is what's best for us. Psalm 16:11 says, in your presence is fullness of joy, and your right hand there are pleasures forevermore. John chapter 7 said, Jesus said, he who believes in me, as the scripture says, from his innermost being will flow rivers of living water. John 10, he said, I have come that you may have life and have it abundantly. I am the way. I am the truth. I am life. That's what Jesus said. You want life? You want what's best? It's me. And so God knows that for us to seek our highest satisfaction in something other than him is death for us. Jeremiah chapter 2, God calls the heavens to be appalled and to shudder with great horror. He says, because my people have committed two sins. They've forsaken me, and then he describes himself as the spring of living water. And he says, and they have dug for themselves cisterns, broken cisterns that cannot hold water. And God, who knows us inside and out, says there is something horrible that happens. It's destructive to the human soul to take a created thing and make it an ultimate thing. It's destructive. And so for you to love something more than me is death to you. And so God, because he loves us and wants what's best for us, and because what's best is him, then the most loving thing he will do is he will move us to a place where we cherish him more than anything else. And so if there is something in the way of that that's a rival to these affections, he'll either remove it or he will topple it from its place of prominence. It'd be like if I had a son who was a painter. And that kid was talented, could paint, but then started sniffing it too to get high and was killing his brain cells, right? What would I do as a dad? I'd take his paint away. Now, is paint in itself evil? No, can really spruce up a room, right? But what he's done with it is evil and destroying him. And so out of love, what am I going to do? I'm going to take it away from him. Right? Even if he rages against me for doing so, I am saving him. And I said, this is moving out, and I've got to reset the way you deal with created things. Because when you make created things, ultimate things, you ruin your soul. And I won't allow that. I won't allow that. And so God comes to an Abraham who's loved two things his whole life, God and this kid. And God says, it's time. Which one, Abraham? And he puts him to the test. So how's Abraham going to respond? I mean, it's easy to talk about this theologically. Well, God wants what's best. What's best is him. So we all forgot. Yeah, okay, yeah. But we're still in a place where God just told Abraham, kill your son. So how are you going to respond when God says that? What's Abraham going to do? What would you do if I were him? Well, God, you were loving, so you'd never do something that's not loving. It would be unloving for me to kill the kid, so therefore that must not have been you talking. Amen, thank you. Okay, and then moved on with life. Is that what Abraham does? Verse 3. So Abraham rose early in the morning and saddled his donkey and took 2 of his young men with him and Isaac his son, and he split wood for the burnt offering. And he arose and he went to the place of which God had told him. And on the 3rd day, Abraham raised his eyes and saw the place from a distance. Did you see that? What does he do? He obeys. And it's instant. It's like eerie instant, right? It's not just that he obeys. Did you notice where it starts? It says, so he rose up early. He gets an early start. I mean, does that weird you out a little bit? Kill the boy. Okay, better get up, rise and shine. All right, and he starts cutting, here we go. All right, and you're like, what is happening? I don't know if that bothers you, but when you read through this, you go, wait a minute, this sounds crazy. God, you sound crazy? Abraham, you're crazy for listening to him? Give me the wheel. I don't trust either of you people anymore. And yet Abraham seems okay. What is going on in his mind? I remember, it's interesting, there's an old movie, I think it was George C. Scott that plays Abraham, and when they do this thing, you wonder, what would Abraham's response be when God says, sacrifice Isaac? What's his response? In the movie, George C. Scott, I think, does what you would think he does. He's like, no! And he like tears his clothes, not the boy, why? I mean, he just fruits out, right? You don't get that in the Bible at all. What you get's an early start. So you go, what on earth is going on in Abraham's mind? What's going on in his mind when he rides for 3 days? Well, the funny thing is, we know. Hebrews 11 tells us. In verse 17, it says, by faith, Abraham, when God tested him, offered Isaac as a sacrifice. He who had received the promises was about to sacrifice his one and only son, even though God had said to him, it's through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned. Now, so far, I've not told you anything we didn't know. All 17 and 18 has told us is this, that he was about to sacrifice his son, even though God told him it's through Isaac that all these generations that I've been telling you about for years are going to come. So we knew that was happening. This is the boy through whom my generations are supposed to come. God just told me to kill him. That's the problem. Hebrews laid it out very succinctly. Okay, and yet Abraham's on his way to kill him. What's going on in Abraham's mind? If it were me, I would have stepped down and go, God, you told me you were going to have generations through him. Now you want me to kill him. You're clearly being inconsistent. God, why don't you go back home, think things through, bounce it off some angels. But I'm going to sit here with the boy because we're not going to do what you're telling us to do. And I'm going to veto God based on my own reason, right? How many times have you done that? No, God. I'm going to marry him, right? Or whatever. So I would have punted. And yet verse 19 says, Abraham reasoned that God could raise the dead. And figuratively speaking, he did receive Isaac back from death. So what's going on in Abraham's mind? God told me that I'm going to have generations come from him that'll bless the whole world. God told me to kill him. Well, I guess God's going to raise him back to life because he hasn't had any kids yet, and my God never lies. And his promises are true, and my God is faithful. And so I'm going to obey, and the details are God's business. How about that? What kind of faith is that? Hey, I don't understand the mechanics, but I trust you, God, so I'm going to do what you say. It's interesting. I'm pretty sure I've told this story before, but it's the only one that really fits this moment for me, and that is my brother's a Navy SEAL, and it takes about 6 months to become one. It's not an easy process, and there's all kinds of tests they put them through when they're trying to weed them out, but all the tests have a purpose. They have a goal. And they got weekends off as they went through this deal, and I remember talking with my brother on one weekend. He was just updating me on what they were doing. And he said, yeah, we were just in this classroom, and they were teaching us what to do if we were swimming underwater, and through some accident we get all our gear ripped off, how to put our gear back on and clear all the water out of our masks. And so they taught you that in the classroom? He said, yeah, and then they went and had us do it. And I said, what did you do? And he said, well, they made us lay down on the concrete on our backs next to the pool with our heads kind of over the edge of the pool. He said, and then they filled up our masks with water and put them on our face, and they cover your nose and your eyes. And then they told us, clear your mask. I said, how do you clear it? And he said, well, they tell you you'd be underwater, so you can't. He said, what you do is you just breathe normally, and then you relax, and the water will slowly drain down your nasal passage into your stomach. And that's how you clear your mask. And I said, are you serious? So they told you to relax while water comes down your nose into your stomach. And he said, yeah. I said, how'd that turn out? He said, well, we were all laying there, and the guy to my left and the guy to my right, as soon as they got there, it felt uncomfortable, so they panicked, and they seized up, and so both of them, they choked and vomited instantly. He said, so we were all laying in a pool of vomit. And I said, well, that's delightful. Thank you. I said, what'd you do? And he said, Ben, I just did exactly what they told me to do. He said, and it was just weird, and I didn't even understand all of it, but you just lay there, try to relax, breathe normally, and the water kind of trickles down your throat, and it clears out your mask, and you can see. And I said, so is this whole process just insane for you? And he was like, Ben, it's awesome. I said, you want to talk me through how laying in a pool of vomit, sucking water through your nose is awesome? I don't really understand that sentence. And I remember his response was, Ben, it's because these guys aren't wasting my time. See, he had been in organizations in college where he joined it as a guy where they make you do some things that have no purpose. They're like, eat that. All right. And he's just like, he had no patience for that. He said, these guys never waste my time. He said, these guys have been in the field. These guys understand. These guys know. And when they come to me, everything they're having me do has a purpose, and that purpose relates directly to saving my life and help me accomplish the mission I'm made for. So when they tell me to do something, I often have no understanding of how the process works, and it sounds crazy. But Ben, all I have to do is do what they say, and it works. And so this has been awesome. And that's exactly where Abraham is. See, God's been messing with Abraham his whole life. And Abraham at times had gone, okay, God, I'll trust you. And at times he's like, no, I'm doing it my way. And it never works. And so finally he's at a place where he's like, you know what? I don't understand, but I'm willing to admit that I don't contain all knowledge in my mind. So God, I don't understand your plan. I can't reconcile what you're doing, but I trust you. I trust you, God. And so here's my life. Here's everything I got. And I believe you. All I'm going to do is I'm going to be faithful and obey your word. And I trust the details to you. And that's how he can say in verse 5, and Abraham said to the young men, stay here with the donkey. I and the lad will go over there, and we will worship and return to you. He says, we're going to worship. We're going to come back. I don't fully understand how, but that's not my problem. Verse 6, it says, Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac his son, and he took in his hand the fire and the knife, and the two of them walked on together. And Isaac spoke to Abraham his father and said, my father. And he said, here I am, my son. And he said, behold, the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering? Isaac's a sharp kid. He's starting to pick up. I see everything but a lamb, Dad. And Abraham said, God will provide for himself the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. So the two of them walked on together. Now, I don't think Abraham's trying to be tricky there. I don't know. I guess we'll find out. I think he's saying, you know what? I think he's being honest. I don't understand the mechanics, but I trust God. And so I'm going to obey the words of God, even when I don't understand. And so the two of them walked on together in complete complicity. Verse 9, then they came to the place of which God had told him, and Abraham built the altar there and arranged the wood and bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Now, conservative scholars have Isaac somewhere between the age of 13 and 20. Couldn't be younger than 30. You can't be 6 and carry wood up a mountain. Right? So he's an old enough kid. How old? Old enough to get away from a 120-year-old man who wants to kill him on an altar, right? So could Isaac have gotten out of that situation? I think so. And so I think you see here a son whose will is in complete complicity with his father's will. They trust God together. And in verse 10, and Abraham stretched out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. God lets him go that far. I mean, God could have stopped him when he was saddling the donkey, right? All right, George. What? Oh, never mind. Oh, good. Glad that's over. That was stressful. All right. Could have stopped him when he was cutting wood. Could have stopped him on day 1 or day 2 or day 3 of the journey. Didn't do any of that. Could have stopped him on the way up the mountain. Could have stopped him when he was building the altar. Could have stopped him when he was putting the wood around it. Could have stopped him when he was tying up the kid. He waited until he had the knife up and moving. And God says, whoa, 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 whoa. Okay. And he called to him, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, here I am. Hanani. I'm right here, God. And he said, do not stretch out your hand against the lad and do nothing to him. For now I know that you fear God, since you've not withheld your son, your only son, from me. He says, now we see it. Like we talked about in James, your faith that was present is now vindicated, seen in the way you live. Now I know it, now you know it, that you value me more than anything else. And that's what God was looking for. I've got to be the ultimate thing in your life, if your life's going to make any sense. Now, before we close out, we go, okay, what was up with all that? Like, why would God do this? Why does God do this to you? Why does he make you take the thing you love and have so much uncertainty with it and have to give it over to him? Why is he going to do that to you? He's going to do this to you. Why does he do this to us? Well, there's 4 benefits I want to look at. and then we'll be done. Number one is when we trust God with everything. When we say, I'm holding nothing back, God, even the most precious things in my heart. When we live like that, the beauty is we get to watch God provide. We get to watch God provide. You see it in verse 13. It says, then Abraham raised his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him a ram caught in the thicket by his horns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered him up as a burnt offering in the place of his son. And Abraham called the name of that place, the Lord will provide, as it is said to this day, in the mount of the Lord it will be provided. See, the name Moriah means the place to meet with God. And Abraham calls it Yahweh Yireh, the place where God provides. And when you decide, I'm going to walk with God, and I'm going to trust him with my life, you get to not just dwell with God, you get to see God provide for your life. And that's an exciting place to live. I remember I had a friend, I met her when she was 30. And for her, she went to A&M, graduated from A&M. And for her, when she was graduating, all of her friends were doing what a lot of young college girls were doing. They were moving on to Dallas to get jobs, find husbands, get married, live a life, and just kind of go for it in Dallas. And so for her, all her friends were going that way, but she just felt like God was tugging on her heart and tugging on her heart. Not you. I want to send you to China. She wanted to get married. And yet she was like, okay, God, I'm going. And so she spent the next several years laying her life down in some obscure little town in the middle of nowhere, China. And yet she got to see God use her. And she got to be a part of some amazing things. But after several years, she came home, and there was a season. She came home, and all her friends have little houses and little lives and money. She didn't have any money, but she's had a couple years of faithfulness behind her. And she's sitting here and going, okay, what's next? So she joins a church because she wants to grow and serve. She starts volunteering with the youth, starts working with the young people, investing in them with the words of God. And as she does that, she meets my junior high pastor. And he was like a ram caught in a thicket, right? He didn't know what was happening, right? He was like, oh, all right. And they dated for 1 month. And I'm not advocating dating for 1 month and getting married, but they're 27, 30, and very mature people. But they got to watch God provide. They got to sit there for years of going, okay, God, I don't know, but you know what I do know? I'm going to be faithful. And in the midst of the fields of faithfulness, God brought them together. And they love to tell their story. They love to tell their story. And it's a beautiful one of God gave you to me in God's perfect timing. I had a friend who just had a passion to get his doctorate in religious studies, just desperately wanted to do it. But he had other passions, wanting to work with international students, wanting to get married, and they all just slammed together and conflicted and made a mess for years. And I remember for him, he got married and then had kids. Some of his kids had medical problems, and so that cost a lot of money. And then he started working with international students, trying to pursue a degree, and the degree door just kept getting slammed shut. And so for him, we used to talk on the phone. He used to struggle with it and just wanting so much to pursue this intellectual side, and it's over. And yet God's called him to internationals and given him this family. And how does it all reconcile? And it was just a mess. And then he called me a week ago. And he said, Ben, I got the craziest phone call. I got asked to be a part of a ministry in London, working at King's College, where 43% of them are international students in the most international city on the planet. Oh, and while I was there, I met Alistair McGrath, and I'm going to do my doctoral work under him, one of the top 3 Christian historians on the planet today. And I'm like, now I'm jealous of you, all right? I like where I am. But anyway, you walk with God, he's going to make you bury things, and he's going to bring them to life in his own time. And you get to watch God provide. And that's an exciting place to live. And not only that, God does this to us because now Abraham's in a place where he can handle the blessings of God. Look in verse 15. It says, then the angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time from heaven and said, by myself I have sworn this, declared the Lord, because you have done this thing and have not withheld your son, your only son, indeed I will greatly bless you and will greatly multiply your seed as the stars from the heavens, sand of the seashore. He says, okay, because you've done this, because you were willing to give it to me and weren't clutching it tightly, now I am free to bless you greatly and do all these things I promised to do to you earlier. But I had to wait until your heart was right? I've told you this story about me. God's done the same kind of thing with me. When I was in college, right at my senior year, I was starting to discover, I think God had given me some abilities to communicate, and he was starting to give me places where I could teach. And then one summer, towards the end of my college career, I got to travel with a guy who was traveling and speaking, and I was kind of his sidekick and went around, and I thought, okay, God is dialing me up to do this with my life. God's going to put me on stages. I'm going to tell people what God thinks, and it's going to be great, and off we go. And then I got to the end of college. I didn't have a job. And no one was calling, and all these doors were shutting. And I'm like, I don't know. And for months, it was like, God, what is going on? And then I got a call from one guy at this little church plant. He said, have you ever thought about being a youth pastor? And I said, no. He said, well, you want to come? And I did. And they were meeting in a living room. And the pastor who was teaching was also the worship leader. He would just sit behind his keyboard and be like, bum, amen, open your Bibles. And I'm like, I don't know how to feel about this. And I remember I went there and, man, I got there and my ministry started. I had 4 students and 4 leaders. And by the end of about 3 months, I had 0 leaders. They didn't like me. I ran them all off. That summer, I started planning this whole summer calendar. I came up with this calendar. I wrote all these Bible studies, was so excited about it. The first Bible study came around. There was one kid. And there was one kid week in and week out for months. And it wasn't funny. Like, God, what are you doing? And I remember I used to drive. At that time, I was living at my mom's house. It was a 45-minute commute to go minister to one kid. And I remember driving in the car, listening to this Charlie Hall song, and he said, God, though you slay me, I will hope. Your hope is my anchor in this world. And I used to just pray that, driving. I'm like, God, you are slaying me. You are killing me in the suburbs. So I don't know what you're doing with my life. You've buried me out here. And months into it, God just kept pushing me into this place. And I've told y'all before, he got me to a place where he asked me the question, do you love me? Yes, I love you. Then feed my sheep. One sheep. That's all I trust you with at this moment. And you know what? He was right. And God had to take me to a place where this desire to have some success in ministry, he had to take it out behind the barn and shoot it. And there in the middle of the suburbs of Spring, God saved my life. Because in the middle of that, I figured out I loved God more than I loved my success. And I loved God more than I loved what people thought about me. And I remember I got to a place where all I wanted to do was know him. And I was literally in this place where saying, God, I am buried and I'm happy buried. And then I got a call to speak at this singles ministry of several hundred people. Biggest thing I'd ever spoken at. And I remember showing up there, and I remember pulling up in the parking lot. And I had the strangest moment. 5 years after this deal, I started laughing and crying at the same time in my car. Like, if anyone drove by, they probably thought I was nuts. I was like, all right. And they were like, that guy's insane, right? But I was laughing because finally I had arrived at this moment when I was on stage. And I did not care at all. And I wept because I said, God, thank you that you finally got me to a place where I love you more than I love what people think of me or anything else. And when he got me there, then he said, now I can put you up on a stage because it's not about you anymore. So I get young guys come to me all the time. How do I get to do what you do? You beg God to kill your pride and hope he doesn't put you on a stage. That's what you do. That's what you do. That's my answer. And you go and serve him and walk with him and let him bury you in the dirt because it's there you'll find hope. And it's when he gets you here, when you say, even Isaac, God, even Isaac, all of it, take it. I just want to know you. When you get there, then God is free to bless you because you're not going to do something weird with it. And so he's free to bless him. And not only that, Abraham gets to be a part of what God is doing. It says in verse 18, in your seed, all nations of the earth shall be blessed because you've obeyed my voice. He says, hey, Abraham, now you're going to get to see me provide for your life, and that's going to be glorious. I get to bless you because now you can handle it. And not only am I going to bless you, you're going to get to be a part of what I'm doing to bless the world. It's not just go you, now you get to do this. It's through your seed I'm going to bless the whole earth. Now I get to bless you. So I had a young man in my ministry once who had a girl he thought he was going to marry. Called her and asked for her dad's phone number because he wanted to have the talk with her dad. And when he asked for her dad's phone number, she's like, yeah, about that. We need to talk. And she broke it off with him. And he was devastated. And I remember talking to him a couple months later, and he said, you know what, Ben? God broke my heart. He said, but and then he put me out and had me working with these high school young men. He said, and God showed me what I called love was just a mess. And God is showing me how to care about these people like God cares about them. He said, I've never prayed like this before. I've never yearned for Christ to be formed in another human being like this before. I've never loved like this. And I think God broke my heart so he could heal it and make me tender. And so God saved his life. Let him be a part of something great. God will do that with you. Hey, give it all to me, and I'm going to use you. I'm not going to waste your life. I'm going to use you to bless this world. And the last thing, and what I think is the greatest thing, is that Abraham gets to see a deeper part of God's heart than anybody else. When you say, God, my life is yours, God gives you access into the deepest parts of his heart. Psalm 25 says, the secrets of the Lord are for those who fear him, and he will make them know his covenant. See, it's interesting. Galatians chapter 3 says this. It says, the scripture foreseeing that God would justify the Gentiles by faith preached the gospel beforehand to Abraham. Abraham got to hear the gospel before anybody else. And it says, all nations will be blessed through you. So he heard that. Hey, I'm going to bless the whole world through you, Abraham. So those who are of faith are blessed with Abraham the believer. And then Galatians 3:16 tells us this about this little moment on the mountain. It says, now the promises were spoken to Abraham and to his seed. And then Paul says, and notice it doesn't say seeds as referring to many, but rather to one, and to your seed, that is Christ. What Paul says in the New Testament is, it was in this moment that God comes to Abraham and says, I'm going to bless the whole world through you. And not through you like through all your kids, not like through everyone who was born out of Abraham. It's through your seed. And then Paul says, notice the word seed is singular. He said it was the singular seed. What he told Abraham is, I'm going to bless the world through your seed. And that guy, his name is Jesus. His name is Jesus. Jesus had a conversation about this. John chapter 8. Ticked off a lot of Jewish people. They actually wanted to kill him by the end of the conversation. He says, if I glorify myself, my glory means nothing, but my Father, whom you claim as your God, is the one who glorifies me. Though you don't know him, I know him. And if I said I didn't, I'd be a liar like you. So already he's off on a shaky foot with these guys, right? And then he tells them, your father Abraham rejoiced at the thought of seeing my day. He saw it and he was glad. And they said, you know Abraham? You were born before him? And he says, you bet I was. He says, before Abraham I am. And so Jesus tells them, hey, you know what? He said, there was a day where Abraham, your daddy, he saw me. He saw me and he rejoiced. He looked forward to that day. Abraham standing on this mountain got to see God's solution to the human problem. See, there's something interesting about that mount he's standing on where he sacrifices this ram in replacement of his son. The mountain's called Moriah, and you only hear the name one other time, 2 Chronicles 3, where it says Solomon built the house of the Lord in Jerusalem on Mount Moriah. You see, this mountain was where hundreds of years later they were going to build the city of Jerusalem. And not just the city of Jerusalem, but this passage says it's going to be where they build the temple. What was the temple for? The temple was a place they would worship God, and interestingly enough, they would blow a ram's horn to call people to worship. Why? Because God provided a ram for Abraham on that mountain. And so when the ram's horn blew, they would come to the temple. What would they do there? They would sacrifice an animal before God. And it was a picture of someone will shed his blood in my place. 2 Chronicles 3 will also say that it was on this very site that David had prepared the threshing floor of Ornan. And we won't go into that story, but there was a plague killing David's people because of sin. And David came, and on this mountain, it says David gave an offering to the Lord, and God removed his penalty for sin. And so it's interesting in this moment, this passage says, Abraham got to see that it is through his seed, Jesus, that the whole world would be blessed. And as he stood on this mountain, he stands there in Moriah, Abraham and Isaac walking together in complete complicity towards this mountain. Just like Jesus and his Father. Jesus who said, I do nothing apart from the will of my Father. Abraham walked his son to Moriah. And we find out in the New Testament that Jesus set his face like stone towards Jerusalem. Abraham laid the wood on the back of his son and made him carry it up the mountain while he, as his father, carried the implements of his death. Jesus took the wood on his back and climbed that same mountain. And it was his father who was coming to sacrifice him. Neither son cried out in complete complicity with their dad. And yet when it came time for Abraham to sacrifice his son, God said, no. No, only one of us will do that. And this mountain is called God Will Provide. I'll provide the sacrifice. I'll provide the bloodshed for all the awful things that have been done. And it won't be your son. It'll be mine. It'll be mine. And when Jesus was hung on the cross, the knife didn't stop. It plunged all the way in. And God sacrificed his son so that the whole nations would be blessed. That all the horrible things you've done and that have been done to you could be paid for by that man. And so that's why when Matthew chapter 1 begins, it says this is the record of the genealogy of Jesus, the son of Abraham. That's why when Mary is approached by the angel and she's told, hey, you're going to be pregnant, even though you're not married, it's going to really complicate your relationships. She sings, she rejoices, and she says, finally, the one has come that fulfills the promise made to Abraham and his descendants forever. This is the seed who will bless the nations. How will he bless the nations? He'll be laid on a piece of wood on this mountain to have his blood shed for us, that we might have life. That we might have life. And Abraham, standing thousands of years before Jesus, gets to see this. And for us, when you say, okay, all these ambitions, all these directions for my life, I don't know, God, I don't know. You may let me have them, you may take them forever, but my hands are open. When you live like that, he's going to take care of you. If he's for you, who's going to stop you? He's going to bless you. He's going to make you a blessing. And he's going to let you see what he's doing in the universe through his son, Jesus Christ, whom I hope you know and cherish and walk with for a lifetime, because that's where life is found. That's what's best. That's where God is driving us. And might we walk with him on this road.
Well, welcome to this part of the podcast. We're glad that you're listening today. And Ben, last night we were wrapping up the series of Life of Abraham, and everybody just heard your talk. And I think it was really interesting. I've heard from a lot of different students that it was really impactful. A lot of great things happening with people, but a lot of questions.
Yeah.
So we're going to get straight to it right now on this podcast. We're not going to beat around the bush. We're just going to go straight in, and I'm going to ask you some questions.
Great.
Just related to last night, because we don't want to draw this part out too long, but we want to kind of give some time for people to, kind of have some things answered, or maybe you can give us some direction on helpful, things to read and that kind of thing. So,
sure, yeah.
First question is, how could God ask Abraham to sacrifice his son?
Yeah.
I mean, how could a loving God do something like that?
Yeah. That's it's funny because preaching it, we decided to just follow the narrative. What's the point that the Bible's trying to make with this? But this text comes up a lot now because of different issues. And this is probably one of the biggest one that's come out the last couple of years. I mean, it's been a big issue for centuries. People have debated this for years, but lately it's become even more popular, particularly for atheists, to point at this and go, see, look at your God, he's inconsistent. And so it's a difficult issue. And we won't cover it all in this section. I'll say a couple things, but I would say helpful reading, if you want to move further into that, would be Tim Keller's new book that just came out, Counterfeit Gods. He addresses it directly. And he doesn't spend a ton of time on it, but he references some other resources, and maybe he spends enough time that would be sufficient for some of your questions. But a quick way to say it is, how could God even say that? One, I think we really covered it in the talk in the sense of all through God's dealings with people, he's calling them to not love things more than they love him. And this was the thing. Now it was a person. And you go, okay, is God going to call someone to do this later? Well, no. And you do see in the Bible, you want to be careful with words like progressive revelation, because some people use them now to talk about revelations continuing to progress, and we're getting new words from God. And I don't believe that. I think, and that's a whole different talk on the nature of the authority of Scripture and kind of issues. But you do see God progressing with humanity and what he lays out for them. But in the culture he's engaging Abraham in, the firstborn was the family. He carried everything in the family. And so God said, I want you to give me your firstborn. that was actually something other cultures would do, sacrifice their firstborn son to the gods kind of thing. And so there was some sense of, okay, it didn't seem like totally out of left field, like what on earth, you know? And yet God will tell him, no, stop, I don't want you to do that. This was a test to see where your heart is. And then as God reveals his will further on down the road, he says, in actuality, I never want this to happen. He says that directly in Exodus 13. But maybe an imperfect analogy of just like, okay, how could God say this here and then later say, I never want that to happen? It's kind of like, it's not God being inconsistent. That's the thing people say. It's more like God being a good parent, you know? I mean, when I have a 3-year-old, I tell him, never cross the street, you know, if I'm not there. Why? Because they can't handle it. And I don't give them all the implications as to why. I don't talk them through all why. That's just all they know. They don't have all knowledge. They don't even have a significant amount. I just say, hey, don't cross the street. And later, as they're growing and maturing and developing, I tell them, okay, you can cross the street now. You don't look at me and go, hypocrite, you know, you're a liar and inconsistent. You go, no, that's good parenting. As they've developed, I develop how I deal with them. And you see God doing that through human history. With cultures, and again, that's a bigger conversation to get into, but you see as he's developing with cultures, he's not saying one thing and then another. He's developing, progressing. Okay, sacrifice these animals. Okay, now stop. That was an image. That was a picture of something I wanted to show you. And so you see this progression of I'm teaching you some basic things and developing along the way. And I think this is one of those huge developmental pieces you see. But again, a lot of questions with that, but we won't. We'll hit some other ones, but again, if you want to go deeper into that issue, Tim Keller's Counterfeit Gods is a great direction to go.
Yeah, I've actually been reading that book and even not realizing that it was going to deal with basically what we've been studying.
Yeah.
And it was interesting how he even pointed out that he didn't ask him to go into Isaac's tent and murder him.
Yeah.
There was a slow progression, and even he didn't ask him to go and sacrifice his wife, Sarah, because that would have been way out of left field for Abraham. So this was within reason.
Yeah.
You know, it wasn't completely fathomable for him. So
and that's the difficult thing we can do is we can read our perspective into a text and not take into account culture and things like that. And so we'll recommend in a little bit too, just books about, you know, kind of understanding Genesis. But yeah, it was interesting. I didn't read Keller's book in preparation for this, and then I read it and I'm like, oh, this is great.
Yeah.
People should read this. So anyway.
Well, we have another question here. Verse 12, where it says, "For now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me." And some people will say, okay, that's inconsistent. You know, how can God know everything? But then he says here, now I know. So some people are kind of pointing to that and trying to poke holes into Christianity, into God.
Yeah.
And how do you respond to that?
Yeah. Well, I mean, if that first question was a lot about sort of, it's become an attack piece for an atheistic crowd, this has become kind of a rallying cry for an open theism crowd, which would still call themselves Christian, but would say open theism is God's foreknowledge is limited. He doesn't know. Like, you can do things to surprise God because he doesn't have all knowledge of future events. And so you are, and they're saying that because they want to preserve a human freedom. That's their goal. They would say, we need to preserve human freedom, which means if we're free to do whatever, then it can't be known beforehand. So God doesn't know stuff. And so in passages like this, when God says, now I know, it's because God didn't know before. The problem with that view and what they're running into now is you just got way too many verses about God's omniscience and sovereign guidance of the whole world. I mean, the scriptures are filled with them. You know, it's actually given as a basic definition of what it means to be God, you know? So Isaiah 46:9, he says, I am God, there's no one like me. And then to unpack that, he says, declaring the end from the beginning, from ancient times, things which have not been done, saying, my purposes will be established, I'll accomplish all my good pleasure. God says, I'm God. You want an example of it? It's because I know everything from the end to the beginning. And Proverbs 16, you wouldn't even have to leave Proverbs 16. I mean, it tells you the lot is cast into the lap, but every decision is from the Lord. In his heart a man plans his course, but the Lord determines his steps, you know. to the man belong the plans of the heart, but from the Lord comes the reply of the tongue, is even what it'll say. Ephesians 1:11 will just wrap it up. He works all things after the counsel of his will. That there's nothing that isn't known by God and driven by God. From your very day you were born, Psalm 139, in your book were written all the days of my life, all the days that were ordained from me, when yet there was not one of them. I know when you're going to be born. I know when you're going to die. And then he told Jeremiah in 1:5, I formed you in the womb. I knew you, and I set you apart before you were born to be a prophet, to do what you're doing right now. So God tells him, I'm doing all this. He tells David, you went out to battle, but I won them all. Like, God controls everything, knows everything. There's this absolute, all through Scripture, our God rules and knows. And so you've got that in there, and you go, okay, so then how do I make sense of passages like this? And what you do is, as you're reading through Genesis and really much of the Pentateuch, you see what we would call anthropomorphisms. Anthropology is, the study of man, anthropos, and then morphism is to look into. So anthropomorphism is God looking like a person. And he uses that kind of language to condescend to us, not condescending in a bad way, but to come down in language you understand and to interact with us. In the same way you would simplify your language when talking to a child. God will come down to us and use language we understand. And you see it all through Genesis. So he comes to Adam and says, where are you? Well, God knows where he is. It's not about God going, where is Adam? Cain, where's your brother Abel? Cain says, I don't know. And God says, well, his blood's screaming from the ground. So what do you find out there? Well, God knew where Abel was. He wasn't asking that question because he didn't know. See, that's the problem if you're going to try to be like super literal with these. You go, no, okay, God was asking that, but it's not because he didn't know. He's asking because he wants you to deal with this. He tells Noah after the flood, I'm going to put my bow in the sky, and when I see it, I will remember my covenant with you. That doesn't mean he's forgotten it, that God has a bad memory, and he's like, oh, I'm going to kill it. Oh, the rainbow. Never mind. I knew I'd put there for something. That's not what he means by that. And so God uses these words, and we fill in the content of how we respond to them, but you got to realize when I'm dealing with God, I'm dealing with somebody very different. And so I think when he says, now I know, I don't think it means he didn't know before. I think it means there's a space-time encounter with this where it's been confirmed. But God told him in Genesis 12, hey, all these promises I'm going to do. He told him they're going to happen. And now he says, because you've done this, now I'll confirm them all. So you go, so which was it? They were going to happen because of God's sovereign guidance, or they were going to happen because of God and Abraham's cooperation? And the answer is yes. That's the biblical answer, is God rules it all. And yet somehow in that he gives us the ability to make actual choices and decisions. And is there conflict in that? Yeah, but Scripture's not afraid of that. It's not like, whoops, that was a big oversight in the Bible. The Bible's actually extremely comfortable with that. And what you run into is you go, okay, so my knowledge is limited when you come to that issue. Again, a lot more we could say. I'm just trying to move us along.
Yeah, no, thank you. Well,
I'll say this. A good book there would be Millard Erickson's book, What Does God Know and When Does He Know It? It's pretty straightforward. That's directly about this issue.
You're like, what is this book about?
Exactly. So it's a quick read, too.
Okay, well, good. Cool. Well, so students that were there last night sitting, I know many of them probably left Reed Arena and then were asking, okay, so how do I really know when God is asking me to give something up?
Yeah.
And then, like, how do I identify that thing? All those kind of questions start to kind of unpack for people. What would you say to the person that's thinking that right now after they've listened to this, talk?
Well, it's a good, it's a question I got a lot last night. It's just, okay, because you can walk away from this talk and go, okay, that means if I like something too much, then that's evil. And so God's going to take it from me. And then you're scared of God and you're scared to like things. And then you go, am I supposed to listen to a voice that tells me to kill the things I love? And which voice is God's voice? And you can really freak yourself out. And that's not really the point at all. That's not it. For us, the point is what God wants in Abraham is what he wants in us, that you value me over anything else. Seek first the kingdom of God, and don't worry about money. Don't worry about clothes. Don't worry about something. You seek me, And what happens to a lot of us, and it's very real in college, is you're worried about, can I get this job I want, or can I get this degree, or I want this merit, and you want things so much, and it gets scary, and so you want to chase them or find security or grab them, and the trick is you go, no, I'm going to channel that energy towards God. And I tell people to, the phrase I say to myself all the time is excel at the revealed things. I'm just going to be great at the revealed things. What has God told me? And I don't think you're going to get a voice like Abraham did. God's dealing with Abraham in this way. Why? Because there's no Bible for Abraham to go to. But the more we hear God's voice, we have it written down. So I'm not saying that God can't prompt you in your heart, but I'm saying what I was not advocating last night is, okay, just listen, and whatever voice is in your head, ascribe that to God and do what it says. You can get yourself into a lot of trouble that way.
That's really good. Can you say that one more time, please?
Yeah, I would say so many people take the voice in their head and say, voice in my head equals God. So voice in the head said this, that means God says this, so I have to do it. And you go, okay, you be careful what voice you're ascribing to God. You be really careful with that, This isn't saying ascribe deity to every inner impulse. It's not. And I think a more wise way is I don't need to try to discover some mystic connection with God when he's given me a written one. And he's told me the Spirit of truth will lead the disciples into all truth. And then the Spirit who searches the very mind of God, that's the Spirit that helps me understand the words of God, right? And so I do like Timothy did. I study the Word. I know it well. And then I ask the Spirit of God to open my eyes, that I would see the wonderful things in his law, incline my heart to your testimonies, that I might fear your name. Now I come to his Word, and I sink deep into that, because the will of God is there. And then I begin to walk out those things. And as I do it, conflicts will begin to come, and I'll begin to see, you know what? I love this thing in an unhealthy way. Okay, God, what do you want to do about that? But I don't try to run and come up with some answer and say that's from God. Or I think we can panic and try to run and grab decisions. And I go, that wasn't the point. The point is, I seek God, and as I do that, like for me, I didn't get to a place where I go, you know what? I think I love wanting to teach so much, so I better never teach. No. I just lived life, and I realized as I was living life, okay, God's put me in this place where I'm not doing what I thought I would. And that's just reality. Like, I'm here. Okay, why, God? And then I realized, oh, you're taking this from me because I was being really unhealthy with it. And thank you. That's awesome. And so anyway, there's a lot more we could say on that, but I just think that's a more healthy. What I would hope students would walk away from is, I would hope they would pray and just say, God, here's my heart. And here's where I think I'm broken, but then not make promises. Okay, God, I'm going to not do this thing I love, or never talk to that person again because I care too much about it. It's like, no. What I'm saying is, seek the Lord in his word with his people. Do the healthy things that have been revealed in his word of community. And as you do that, he will lead you. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he'll direct your paths. That's the mystery of it. As you go, he guides me. And as he does, you'll start to see it. But a lot of times it makes sense afterwards. You look back and you go, oh, that's what you were doing.
Well, thanks for putting us in a spot last night, and even while people are listening to this, of looking to God for everything, and then also prizing him above whatever that thing is in our life that we have a hard time letting go of, or that we're striving for. So just for you to stop kind of toward the beginning, I guess, of your talk and remind us that he is better, like the fact that he wants us to love him more than anything else is actually for our good. Yeah. Those things, they don't ever feel good in the moment, really. It's like our feelings kind of start to get in the way a lot of times of this doesn't feel good, but God is good, and he is better, and his ways are better. And even the fact that Abraham got to look back and kind of see that it was all worth it, and experience the seed, Jesus Christ, the gospel, the hope of glory. And so This has been an amazing series.
It's been
I
fun,
have
man.
absolutely loved this, and thanks for just walking us through, kind of guiding us on this deal. So,
Sure, man.
is there anything else you wanted to share, and any other resources that would be helpful? Or are we?
I think those were the three. You know, if you want something to read, those are great. Keller's book is great, and I would mention one more. If you really just want to get into Genesis, I think I mentioned it before in here, but I would just say it again because I've just found it so helpful. That is Bruce Waltke's commentary on Genesis. It's just called Genesis, and it's just. I just think Waltke did an amazing job. And so if you're going, I want to go deeper into Genesis, or I want to keep going, there's so many stories, so much we missed. Then pick up Waltke's book. It's really in the world of commentaries for Genesis. I just have been so happy with that one. But yeah, the last thing I would say, just agreeing with you, man, is that is what I think you have to fix your eyes on, because sometimes when the idea of walking with God, we get this fear because we think of a thing that we might lose. And to walk with God feels like death. And what you have to remind yourself is, okay, he's not doing this to hurt me, and he's better. He is. And the more you take steps like that, if I'm going to walk with you no matter what, God, the easier they become. And but that's where you want to live. That's where you want to live.
Right on.
Cool.
Well, we are going to be on spring break this coming week, so there won't be some crazy podcast or anything that we'll put up on iTunes this week, because we're taking a break, which is always nice. But we're going to be praying for students as they kind of scatter all over the globe and take a break. And then we're looking forward to being back together in Reed Arena in a couple weeks, just to kind of reunite again and do that whole thing. So here we are, spring break 2010.
Yeah, so we'll be back with the second half of the spring. I think it's like halfway point.
Yeah.
Really, talk-wise.
We're halfway there.
Awesome.
Okay, well, thanks again, and have a good day.
See you.